brothers and sisters. Today I want to talk to you about how do we respond to God's call. I want to begin this talk by looking at the parable of the two sons in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 28 to 32. It is the story about the father invites his son to go and work in his vineyard. And the story goes like this. A man had two sons. He came to the first and said, "Son, go out and work in the vineyard today." He said, "I will not." Afterwards, changed his mind and went. The man came to the other son and gave the same order. And his son said, "Yes, sir," but did not go. Brothers and sisters, this story is our story. This parable is our parable. How do we respond to God's call? Do we respond to God's call like the first son? We rejected God's call, said no to God's call, but afterwards we recognize our own failure and then change our mind and then try our best to do God's will, try our best to respond to God's invitation, to God's call? Or do we respond to God's call like the second son? Willingly, freely, and knowingly said yes to God. Say, "Yes, God, I will do it. Yes, God, I will obey your law. I will obey your rules. I will follow your commands. I will follow your plan." But afterwards, did not do at all. It's just an empty words. It's just an empty promise. Brothers and sisters, as we look at the story about the two sons, what is the proper way to respond to God's call? Brothers and sisters, St. Paul challenges us to focus on Jesus. This is the best way to respond to God's call. Is like Jesus responds to God's call. I want to take you to the letter of St. Paul to the Philippians chapter 2, verse 8. It says, "Jesus humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross." Brothers and sisters, St. Paul reminds us to look at Jesus as the ultimate example of right behavior, of right attitude to God's invitation, to God's call. So my dear brothers and sisters, St. Paul wants us to learn from Jesus, which is to always obey God's will, to always obey God's invitation. So my dear brothers and sisters, as we go through these difficult times with the coronavirus pandemic, how do we respond to God's call, to God's invitation? Well, my dear brothers and sisters, we have to obey God's call, God's will. Let His will be done, not ours. Because when we do God's will, we will do better. We will survive. But when we try to do our own will, we will fall, will not survive. So my dear brothers and sisters, I pray that God continue to protect you, to give you the strength so that you can make a right response to God's call. Always obedient to His call, to His will. God bless you.